Hello and welcome to Provoking Tech. I'm Zach, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about the current state of cloud gaming. You can kind of think of this kind of as a State of the Union address for cloud gaming, and I've put a lot of thought into this video, and I'm kind of building upon a lot of the content that I've produced, and especially if you're a subscriber, you've probably seen quite a bit of the content that I have produced relating to cloud gaming. So today's video is kind of going to be a wrap up of where cloud gaming is today, as well as a look at the near future for cloud gaming. So without further delay, let's go ahead and jump right to it. Alright, so the first topic of this video is actually going to be covering something that the teams working on both the hardware and software solutions for cloud gaming have no control over, and that is the general internet infrastructure. This data will mostly be revolving around the US market simply because that's where I live and have some real world experiences to talk about and have some thoughts on why we're seeing this massive growth, but a lot of the general statements I make will ring true no matter where you are. So I found this great graph on Economy, which I'll link in the description below, but some very cool stats is in the last 6 months, which actually ends in Q1 2017, we've seen a 23% growth in our average connection speed in the US. If you compare that graph to the first 4-year span on this graph, we only actually had a 27% growth in our internet infrastructure from the beginning of that span to the end of it, which has ranged from Q3 2007 to Q3 2011. So we're going from a 27% growth in a 4-year span to a 23% growth in a 6-month span. Of course, that is a very rapid piece and might, end up leveling out like the end of 2016 did. So I want to go ahead and throw the last 4 years of this graph in comparison to the first 4 years. We already know that the first 4 years of this graph resulted in a 27% growth. The last 4 years of this graph, which ends in Q1 of 2017, have seen a 127% growth, which is pretty impressive in my opinion. So we really see this graph starting to have some innovation and some growth back in 2011. And I think part of the reason for this growth is that's when Google Fiber announced that they were going to be coming to Kansas City and start to offer fiber services. I'm not saying that Google Fiber is the sole reason why we have so much innovation, but Google is such a huge name. Everybody knows Google. I do think them announcing fiber did really, stir up the pot a little and start to cause some innovation simply because the general consumer would see that Google is offering fiber services and would start to associate fiber with the premium internet option available and started to drive some interest in fiber, whether Google Fiber was offered in that area or a different provider was starting to offer fiber. So I think that they did offer a kind of a big boost, regardless of whether they are the sole reason, for that to be or not. That's a completely different question. But I do think that is part of it though. The graph that I'm scrolling to right now is showing the 25 megabit per second broadband and kind of the percentages of that state's population that have access to a 25 megabit per second broadband connection. So the thing I really found interesting about this graph is the 25 megabit per second kind of goalpost is the point where 1080p 60 FPS gameplay streaming from a cloud server to your local machine is at the point where it is at great quality and very little to no issues with the stream, no pixelization or anything along those lines with your stream. So that's a very cool point. And even the darker green areas are still not, what I would expect a darker green area to be like 80%. The darkest green area that I saw just looking through the data real quick was Delaware at 33.3%. So the darker green area is only a third of the state has a 25 megabit per second or faster broadband plan. But at least we're starting to see growth of this wider spread adoption of the faster broadband plans. And that's going to be great for cloud gaming to become really mainstream, because you essentially, if you have less than that point, you're going to have to knock your connection down to either 30 FPS or 720p or to have some form of compromise in your stream, and that's really going to impact it becoming mainstream in my opinion. And even with some states having like a third of the state having widespread adoption, you do have states like Idaho, which only 7.5% of the state has a broadband plan of 25 megabit per second or faster. One last map I wanted to discuss before I close this section out is the average connection speed map. And you can see that the more rural areas on average have a much slower average internet connection speed than your more population dense states, especially like the states on the east and west coast, which on average end up having a much better average internet connection speed. And I do think, and I do see it in my daily life, that the more rural areas are kind of being left behind in a lot of innovation. And in part, that's because the ISPs, if they can sign up 10,000 people for X investment, would rather do that than sign up 500 people for the same investment. A big factor that I think is really going to shake this up in the next several years is going to be wireless internet becoming more mainstream. So kind of along those lines, Google Fiber has started to step back on its more aggressive fiber rollout, and they acquired WebPass, I think about 2 years ago or so now. And WebPass offers fixed point wireless gigabit, and that's going to allow Google to really roll out, gigabit internet connections even more rural areas, simply because they don't have to run a fiber line to every single home. And especially in a lot of areas, you might not have a home, just on average, say like 200 yards before the next home. And that could get really costly running a fiber line for 200 yards just for one more house, just to adopt one more house to your, internet infrastructure network. So I do think that wireless gigabit is going to play a big role in kind of expanding the average connection speed. And also we are on the verge in 2019 of 5G possibly really shaking things up. If it's half as good as the people behind 5G and the people speculating about 5G say it will be, then it could be a huge turning point for having very fast internet even in rural areas. A big thing that will have to be shaken up there, though, is like the mobile providers like Verizon and AT&T offering a solution for home users to have a decently priced, competitive option using the 5G networks. And if that's the case, and if it's, like I said, half as good as what is being speculated right now, then this map is probably going to change radically from what you see now to about 3 to 4 years from now, after 5G has rolled out and started to become more mainstream on a lot of devices having access to that. So that's pretty much it that I wanted to talk about on the internet connectivity. And it is such a big topic for cloud gaming because having that internet backbone is very important for cloud gaming. It essentially is the biggest point that the people working on software and hardware don't have any control over, but is pretty much equally important as the software and the hardware that those people are working on. All right, moving on to the software side of cloud gaming, I'm actually going to be using some tables and graphs and some visuals from my article that I'm writing for my blog. It's not live at the point of recording this, but it should be live by the time this video goes live, as all I have left to do is just put my finishing touches on it. So on the software side of streaming programs, I essentially have picked 4 different programs to kind of highlight and discuss and talk about in this article. Those are Parsec, Steam and Home Streaming, Moonlight, and Liquid Sky. Moonlight is kind of the exception, simply because I haven't tested them near as extensive. I've only kind of done basic testing with Moonlight. But as I was going through the platform compatibility, I did see a big hole with iOS. And I wanted to have an option that if your primary use case was playing your games on your iOS device, that you would at least have a option out there. But I don't have a lot of data to kind of really start to gauge service on a more in-depth level. Moving on to core functionality, a lot of the stuff here is more subjective because it's based upon my experiences. I have installed these programs multiple times on multiple different devices, so I think I have a pretty good handle on kind of how easy to use and the latency of these different programs. But like I said, it is more subjective and less based on pure hard fact, except with the exception of max resolution, because that is just pure fact. Then a lot of the other data in this article So with that in mind, your experiences may vary based upon mine, but I did just wanted to kind of gauge these, and like I did say, they are more subjective. So the biggest of which is probably low latency, simply because there is ways to scientifically measure that using a high refresh rate monitor, a high FPS camera, and a device that essentially lights up the moment that it detects a click from your mouse, and using that to gauge how much of a period of time passes between the light lighting up and action being triggered in the game. But I don't have any of that hardware right now, so the low latency is purely based on my experience. And talking about Steam, when you're looking at the low latency here, that's if you're playing with Steam Home streaming from a cloud computer, because that is the overall focus of this article. Now moving on to probably the biggest part of this segment is going to be the special features. We've essentially reached a point with the software programs, especially those that have designed their software with cloud gaming in mind, particularly like Liquid Sky and Parsec, that their compression algorithms and the technology behind their software has advanced so much that they're not adding a lot in terms of milliseconds to the overall process. So with that in mind, most of the network or most of the latency that you'll experience when using these programs is really going to come from the network side of things rather than the software side of things in the encoding of the video and the decoding of the video streams. So with that in mind, we're really going to be looking at the special features that these programs offer when trying to choose one that's best for you. So I'm just going to run down the list and talk about some of the special features of all the different programs and kind of highlight some of the cool things about them that really make them stand out. Parsec has a couple very unique and very cool special features with their software. The first of which that I'm going to start with is going to be a little bit more on the nerdy side, but nonetheless still very cool, and that's the integration with multiple cloud providers. So there's nothing stopping you from installing Parsec on like Microsoft's Azure platform, or really any platform out there that offers a tier with like dedicated GPUs, including even installing it on Liquid Sky. So the cool thing about having integration though is with Parsec, they've integrated both with Paperspace as well as Amazon's AWS. The benefits of that though is it gives you the user some flexibility in choosing a cloud hardware provider that fits your budget a little better possibly, but also having some flexibility in choosing a provider that has the data center that's closest to you. So having multiple providers only increases the chance that you have a data center that's closer to you, which is very beneficial for cloud gaming, as that helps lower the latency that you'll experience in your cloud gaming sessions. The next cool feature that I wanted to talk about with Parsec is the ability to share your PC with friends. I've also listed kind of an added benefit from that, which is co-op games with local multiplayer. So there's a couple different use cases of that. There's old school games playing on an emulator. Say you and a friend love playing Super Smash Brothers, but a couple of your friends might have moved to a different town, so they might be 50 miles away, so you might only get to hang out a couple times a month anymore, but you still want to play Smash more than that. They can remote into your computer or a cloud computer that you set up and actually play Smash Brothers or a similar game on a emulator playing on that computer, which is a very cool experience, and kind of reliving that old school split screen, even though you're not really in the same room as each other. And if you have like a second display, you can always do like a Discord chat with video and even see your friends, so you really have that feeling of the old school split screen play, except for the fact that you can't try swiping the controller out of your friend's hand when they're being really annoying and just kicking your butt. So with that in mind, it's a very cool feature. There's also a lot of indie games now that are supporting local co-op or local multiplayer in general, whether that's through like the more traditional split screen or just like a shared screen experience. So that's very cool, having friends just remote in and just playing together in the same game and having that that local multiplayer experience, but just on a single computer. So it's very cool that you can have multiple people connect to the same computer, and it's a very, very cool, unique feature of Parsec at this point in time. All right, I'm actually going to skip down to Liquid Sky because they're the only other software that has a very cool, unique special feature, and that is the ability to actually switch between the hardware tiers that they offer. So all you have to do is just shut down your Sky computer on Liquid Sky and switch to a different tier. This is great because you can install all your games on a single instance, and be able to easily switch hardware tiers based upon the game that you're playing. So if you're playing a lower end game that doesn't require as much, some of the indie games that fall in that category, or something like Overwatch that isn't as demanding, Rocket League, that aren't quite as demanding as some of the higher end games like PUBG, for instance, you can actually turn down to a cheaper hardware tier and not have to completely reinstall all your software, or have to have two machines, one that has a low tier, cheaper option, and then have one that has more expensive but can play the higher end games better. So it's a very cool feature of Liquid Sky. But on that note, their gamer tier is super low end, and can't play a lot of games, but there are still some games you can turn down to the lower tier and save some money on an hourly basis. Alright, so before I wrap up this video, I did want to talk about the cloud hardware performance benchmarks. So I have covered pretty much every game in more depth in individual videos. I probably will end up retesting Players Unknown Battlegrounds in the near future, simply because the Liquid Sky had a mouse issue, which I have found a workaround for, but I just haven't had the time to completely retest it, and I probably will retest the Paperspace ones just because PUBG has done some optimizations, just so that it's a nice, fair overall evaluation. With that in mind, I'll also be continuing to expand this chart, but the overall score I just wanted to touch upon is kind of based upon the end goal of having a 1080p 60 FPS experience, because that's definitely the golden standard of cloud gaming right now, and even just like computer gaming in general. 1080p 60 FPS is a great experience. There are benefits, of course, to playing on the higher resolution and higher refresh rate monitors, but 1080p 60 FPS is still a great experience. So with cloud gaming, the overall score is weighted pretty heavily on that, and I take into account the average FPS as well as the minimum FPS, because those dips are pretty painful, especially if they're dipping quite often. But in addition, I also take into account any issues I had with that hardware tier, if it caused weird issues. For example, when I do retest Liquid Sky, I'll probably dock them half a point, simply because the mouse issue is just an annoyance. And it does detract from the game, and it does happen even in game. You still have to do, once you do the workaround, you can still hit the F12 key to get the mouse back locked, but just having the fact that the mouse does unlock periodically is very annoying. And I also take into account the performance of other tiers when I'm kind of weighing the overall score for different games. One final thing I want to talk about here is essentially how I kind of come upon the actual settings I use. Essentially, I play the games a little bit before I even do a video and do some kind of initial testing. I get a hardware profile or a quality profile for the game that has the best graphical fidelity that I can get, that I have a decent experience with on a couple different hardware tiers. I don't really see the sense of knocking the settings down where every different hardware tier can get a 60 FPS average with a minimum of at 40 FPS or above, simply because of, like, for the Liquid Sky Gamer, which is a pretty low end tier with only like 2 gigabytes of VRAM and like 3 CPU cores. Essentially, if I set where the gamer tier could get 60 FPS average and a minimum FPS of like 40, then every other hardware tier would be at 5 out of 5 every time and have like a 90 FPS average and like a minimum of 60 FPS. So I try to push the graphical fidelity as far as I can while still having a good experience on most platforms. But alternatively, for future videos, what I'll probably do is continue with that kind of trend of testing, but also do a follow-up video where I actually kind of optimize every game for different hardware tiers and show you how far you have to drop the graphical fidelity for that hardware tier, so you can actually get a good sample of how far you'd have to go down and whether you're still happy with that level of quality for that hardware tier, or if you should go ahead and just plan on playing on a higher tier of hardware. So with that in mind, that pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about in the current state of cloud gaming. Alright, so that's pretty much it for today's video, guys. Hopefully you liked it. If you did and you found it either enjoyable, informative, or it got you interested in cloud gaming and where the near future will take cloud gaming, give it a big like. I greatly appreciate that, guys. Also, if you're not already an existing subscriber, smash that subscribe button to stay tuned for more great videos from Provoking Tech. Once again, guys, thanks for watching, and until next time, Zach out.